Okay, we have a good crowd here tonight. We've had over 125 people register for tonight's meeting, and we already have more than 50 of you online already. So we have a lot of information to cover tonight, and we also want to make sure that there's plenty of time for you to participate. So we are going to get started. Welcome to tonight's meeting hosted by Caltrans District 1. And we're talking about the Eureka-Arcata corridor and sea level rise. So now I'd like to turn the program over to Brad Medham, the Deputy Director for Planning with District 1 in Caltrans.
Thank you, Joan. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first ever workshop on sea level rise on the Eureka-Arcata corridor. This will not be the last, but it is the very first one. The state of California, the nation, and the world face a very historic challenge to deal with the effects of climate change. And we at Caltrans have to deal with an infrastructure that is subject to potential flooding or other issues in terms of sea level rise, climate change impacts. So we're here tonight to talk about the corridor, but in a bigger framework of what's going on across the state and across the nation. We have two pieces of it. One of them is, of course, dealing with the impacts, and the other is trying to reduce the greenhouse gases. So that's in our charge as well. We're hoping tonight to hear from you. You'll hear what we're looking at so far, and then we want your opinions, your ideas, see if there are ways to look at this that perhaps we haven't done, and we're going to be welcoming all possible ideas. So with that, looking forward to your input, and Joan, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brad, for getting us off to a good start. So you've just heard from Brad. Now I'll just take a moment to review the agenda and remind you where and when you can participate throughout today's meeting. So Clancy Smet, who is the branch chief for climate adaptation planning in District 1, he's going to be giving a presentation, and at various points throughout the presentation, there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions. And then following that, we're going to open it up and ask you for your issues, concerns, and ideas. And then we're going to get all that done by 7:30, and we'll have closing remarks then and wrap it up. So just to remind you, we do have a large group on the Zoom tonight. Again, we had over 125 registered, and our participation numbers keep climbing. So we will be relying primarily on the chat box. So at various times, we will ask you to submit whether it's your questions, or later in the meeting, we'll be asking for your issues and ideas. That's the best way that you can participate in tonight's meeting, and we'll be receiving all of the information. We also will be downloading and saving the chat, so anything that comes into us, we have a good record. And you just send your chat comment in to the host and co-host, and we receive it, and that will allow us to manage your participation during tonight's program. We also want to engage you in some polling. So we want to learn a little bit about you. So in the Zoom polling activity is going to open in just a moment. My colleague Anna is opening up, and we'd like to know how you describe yourself tonight. And how are you participating? So for example, if you might be a Caltrans person who's also a local resident, and you're here as a resident, that can be how you identify yourself. We reached out to nonprofit organizations, the general public, a variety of agencies, the tribes. We're hoping that maybe some elected officials might join us. And we also know there are numerous Caltrans colleagues on the line here who want to stay up to date with what's happening in the district, but also understanding and hearing how the community is responding to the planning process. So with that, we're going to do a series of quick polling questions, and this is just to give us a little bit of information about who's here with us today. So Anna, let's wrap the polling up on our first question, and if you could share the results. So you can see the bulk of almost half of you identify as local residents. And then we have a number of Caltrans colleagues here tonight, along with local agency representative. We do have one elected official in the midst, and if you would send us your name in the chat box, we would love to introduce you. We really appreciate when elected officials come out to our meetings. So I'll just wait for that chat to come in. And in the meantime, we can go to our next question. So let's go to our next polling question, Anna. So we want to know, how did you learn about tonight's meeting? Caltrans sent out email invitations to contacts that we had. We also had a very active social media campaign on Facebook. We made some phone calls. Some of you may have been referred by a friend or colleague, or there's some other source of information. And for those of you who have checked other, if you could drop your response in the chat, we would love to know how you learned about tonight's meeting. So let's just take a moment and have a few more people answer the polling question. And let's see, so it looks like, Anna, let's share the results to the polling. Okay, so it looks like most of you got an email message. Our Facebook campaign brought in another of folks. We appreciate the friends and colleagues who shared information. And again, for those who submitted we'd love to get some ideas. I also learned, and I'd like to welcome Mike Wilson. He's a coastal commissioner and county supervisor. And then we also have Kim Burgle, Eureka City Council Ward 5. So welcome to our elected officials. We really appreciate your participation tonight. And there's a comment in the chat. Your chats all come in to one person, all the co-hosts behind the scenes, so that we can see the comments and we'll be sharing them as we move throughout. So let's move to our next polling question. And let's see. So Anna, our next question is, how do you travel the Eureka corridor? So is your main mode car or truck? Are any of you using public transit? I'm sure we have some cyclists in the midst. You might be a motorcycle rider. We also have the Bay Trail in the corridor, which makes this corridor walkable. And then if there's any other modes we haven't considered, we'd like to hear from them as well. So let's just take a few more moments and have a few more of you weigh in on the question. So, okay, well, let's wrap up the polling right now. And Anna, if you could share those results. So it looks like, as we expected, most of you are driving, whether it's a car or a truck. We do have some transit users, and a third of you are on bicycles, whether it's electric or a regular bike. And I'm very glad to see also we have some pedestrians using the trail as well. So thank you. We have one more polling question. Actually, we have a total of 6. So Anna, how about our next polling question? If you could tell us how often you travel on the Eureka-Arcata corridor. For many of you, it's daily. It could be weekly, 2 to 3 times a month, once a month, less than once a month, or maybe you're someone who is participating remotely from outside of the area and you don't travel the corridor. So we just like to know how frequently you use the corridor, and that's going to help us understand where many of your comments are coming from. Okay, so just a few more moments for people to weigh in and answer the question. Okay, so how about if we close the polling on that question, Anna, and we can share the results. So we have many daily users. A good part of you use it, weekly, several times a month, and a handful of infrequent users with us here tonight. Okay, well, thank you for that information. And now we'll go to our next question. So what's your main reason for traveling the corridor? So when you think about the most trips that you take, is it for commuting purposes, or do you tend to use it more for shopping and errands, or to get to medical appointments, or maybe it's for recreation because of, so many things you can access along the route, or if there's another reason, we'd like to understand that as well. So we'll give you a few moments to think about how you travel the corridor, your main reason for going there. Okay, so Anna, let's bring the polling to a close on this question and share the results. So it seems like almost half of you are focused on shopping and errands. A quarter of you get to work or school primarily using the corridor. And then we have some other uses for both medical appointments and recreation. Okay, and that takes us to our final question, our final polling question. And this is something Caltrans was really curious about, is since the pandemic, have you changed how frequently you travel on the corridor? So are you traveling more? Are you traveling less? We understand many people are working at home, or they've been able to shift to telecommuting on a regular basis. Or for some, it really hasn't changed that much. But this is something we were really curious about. So we'll just give this a few more moments so that more of you can weigh in. Okay, yeah, we have a comment here that someone used to commute daily and now they're down to 2 to 3 times a month with telework. So for some of you, it's been a big change in how you travel the corridor. Okay, Anna, how about if we share those results with the group? And as you can see, 61% are traveling less frequently. And so with that, let's bring the polling to the close. And we really appreciate you sharing information about yourselves with us. And that's just a little bit of the engagement that we have for you. But in just a moment, we're going to have a presentation from Clancy to Smet. At specific times in the presentation, he's going to stop and ask if anyone has any questions. And that's the time to send them in through the chat. And then following that presentation, there will be time for you to provide us comments on your issues and concerns. So now I'd like to turn it over to Clancy to give our main presentation. And Clancy, we're just waiting for you to start.
Okay.
Okay, we can hear you.
The poll thing was in the way, so it was hard for me to.
Okay.
Can you see my presentation?
We're starting, waiting for the animation to kick in on the first slide.
Oh, all right. California is experiencing increased climate change related impacts along its highway system due to wildfire, sea level rise, and cliff retreat. These events will only become more severe and more frequent through the end of the century. Climate change impacts along the state highway system are driving the need for adaptation projects. As many of you know, Humboldt Bay is experiencing one of the fastest rates of sea level rise on the west coast of the United States. This is a king tide event from 2005, and king tides are tidal events that bring unusually high water levels that can cause local flooding. As the ocean rises, some of the land around Humboldt is subsiding, yet in other places it is rising. The rate of sea level rise has tripled since 1971. The past 6 years have been the warmest on record. There are many variables to consider along the Eureka-Arcata corridor. Oops, sorry, I went one too far. There are many variables to consider along the Eureka-Arcata corridor. There are utility lines, numerous property owners, dikes and levees, and tide gates. In order to be successful, we have to work together to find solutions. Approximately 70% of our facility is protected by someone else's tide gate, dike, or levee. This section of the US Highway 101 between Eureka and Arcata, also known as the EA corridor, is a priority asset in terms of risk to sea level rise and storm surge and the need for adaptation planning. Our broad scope for all Caltrans efforts comprises our three foundational principles that directly impact people's lives: equity, climate action, and safety. People deserve no less than these three principles to be implicit in their lives. We apply all these principles to every aspect of our work, and these principles are at the heart of what we do. Unfortunately, California's transportation sector is the leading culprit in the climate change crisis. The transportation sector is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. Our vehicles' tailpipes contribute to California's largest source of climate change, but we can do better. It is reassuring that both our federal and state administrations are on board with sweeping initiatives targeting our climate. The state is working very hard to address the impact of climate change through legislative mandates, and our work at Caltrans is informed by the promulgation of laws, rules, and regulations. We also engage with federal, state, and local agencies. However, we are prioritizing funding sustainable transportation projects as part of the new climate strategy known as the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. CAIP, as it's known, outlines the key investment strategies for investing billions of discretionary transportation dollars annually to aggressively combat and adapt to climate change while supporting public health, safety, and equity. Pause here for any questions.
Okay. So yeah, so we just want to make sure folks are tracking with Clancy's introduction to sea level rise in the corridor. And we'll give you a moment if there's any questions that anyone has so far, just submit them in the chat. So we'll give you a moment to type in some questions if there's any coming in. Okay, well, let's see, okay, so we don't have any coming in. So Clancy, you're right on track.
Okay.
We do have a question about the definition that Caltrans uses for equity. So if maybe you or Brad could speak to that. And also we may be able to go back to it if you need to get access to some information.
Yeah, I think I could put after I go along with the presentation a little bit, I can put a link to the Caltrans equity statement in the chat, perhaps, or Brad could speak to it right now. He's on the climate or the equity team. So I'll leave that to him if he feels like.
It's a fairly complex statement. I think it'd be easier to put it in the chat, so we'll track that down.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. So how about Clancy? Let's keep moving forward.
Okay. So one of the reasons we're here, Eureka-Arcata corridor is an improvement project that consists of 5 component projects within a 6-mile segment of Highway 101 along the east side of Humboldt Bay. The Eureka-Arcata corridor is identified as critical because it is the primary transportation hub for Humboldt County, and there are a few alternate routes. It contains essential utility lines, residential, business, and recreational amenities that can be affected by sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. The Eureka-Arcata corridor is also vulnerable given its proximity to Humboldt Bay, with several sections of lower elevation than 2 feet above the mean monthly maximum water level. Most of the sections along the EA corridor are of high or moderate risk. In 2019, the California Coastal Commission issued a Coastal Development Permit, CDP, for the 5-component project. Project manager, Jeff Pimentel, is here, and he'll give us some highlights on the current status. Jeff?
Good evening. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you clearly, Jeff.
All right, great. So as you can see here, a map of all the Eureka-Arcata corridor projects. Many of them are actually complete. 2 of them at the bottom are not our projects, but projects that we've partnered with the city of Arcata and Humboldt County on, and I'll get to that in a moment. First project at the top, Indianola Undercrossing and Half Signal. This is kind of the flagship project I know that most people have their eyes on. This project is currently scheduled to go out into construction late summer, early fall of 2022. The Excel deceleration lane project is complete with construction. The cable median barrier project completed construction as well. Our bridge and bridge rail replacement project at Jacoby Creek and Gannon Slough is currently in construction. We've completed rail replacements in the northbound direction for Jacoby Creek and Gannon Slough bridges. And then the remaining portion of that work is the actual bridge replacement of the southbound Jacoby Creek Bridge. If you've traveled southbound on 101 anytime recently, and specifically from July to now, you've noticed that there's a detour through the median, and we have a temporary bridge location there. In July of next year, we'll actually move that bridge into its final location where everyone drove previously, which will be a pretty amazing construction method, what we call a jack and slide operation. So the bridge you're driving on today is actually the final bridge that you'll drive on once it's moved in its final location. And then the replacement of the tide gates was also completed. And then we have Bay Trail North, which is highlighted in yellow there. That was City of Arcata's Bay Trail project, which was completed. And then Humboldt County's Bay Trail South is currently in its final design stages. And we're really happy to be partnering with both City of Arcata and Humboldt County on that, where we'll be actually providing the offsite mitigation for both of those projects as a kind of a joint venture with our mitigation project on the Eureka-Arcata corridor projects in terms of all the wetland impact associated with all of those projects. That mitigation project has begun. We completed all the grading work out at our Samoa site off 255. Planting is still in progress, and then we'll obviously have the long-term monitoring and maintenance of that site. And then we also have a second portion of the mitigation, which is our Spartina eradication project, and that will be commencing soon. We're currently working with the Harbor District and RCAA to kick that process off, so that'll be starting soon as well. I think that was everything I had, but excited to see Indianola start later next year. We previously had actually put that project out to bid, and we unfortunately had to reject all the bids on that in the interest of the state. And so we are repackaging that, and that should go out for advertisement again right around May or June of 22. And then we expect construction to start late summer, early fall of 2022. So I don't know, Clancy, if you wanted to open any questions on that, or if we wanted to wait till the end of the meeting for any questions on the projects. I'll leave that up to you.
Let's wait till the end.
Okay. So if you do have questions for Jeff, get them ready. They'll come in the chat, and there'll be more time at the end to get more details on those projects. So Clancy, why don't you continue?
Okay. So the CDP contains special conditions. The CDP covered the improvement project on the corridor. Specifically, the CDP incorporated two climate change related conditions, special conditions. Special condition 1 is the sea level rise and flooding impact monitoring and reporting. Special condition 2, the long-term sea level rise comprehensive adaptation and implementation plan. What is the CAIP? That is the Comprehensive Adaptation and Implementation Plan. To address the impacts of sea level rise that the project will have, Caltrans is developing the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is due by December 2025. And the sea level rise analysis will be based on the best available science and monitoring reports. The plan will include an evaluation of adaptation alternatives, such as accommodation, protection, relocation, and those alternatives' consistency with the Coastal Act. The plan shall reflect coordination with local governments and public interest groups. And a CDP amendment will be triggered if there are flooding impacts that occur 4 times a year in any 12-month period. Internally, Caltrans has created a climate change working group to make sure that climate change adaptation measures and considerations are part of project development and delivery. Additionally, we are working to create more expertise on climate change within District 1. I have created a sea level rise technical working group to help me with the comprehensive plan. Also, we are eagerly awaiting the data from for Humboldt Bay to be added to the Coastal Storm Modeling System, also known as COSMOS, a tool developed by the USGS. Next, I'm going to talk about the vision. The vision of the comprehensive plan will be a collaborative implementation strategy of short-term and long-term actions to build resilience, the protection of critical resources via multiple lines of defense, including natural and built features. We're going to create community-wide awareness of climate change risks, and the adaptation projects are going to be led by local agencies and supported by federal and state partners. Also, disadvantaged communities will not be disproportionately impacted by flooding impacts or the cost of adaptation. Some of the key assumptions. Many adaptation projects will depend on the availability of funding. Adaptation projects will need to minimize environmental impacts. Projects will need to be based on the least environmentally damaging feasible alternative. Projects that enlarge or expand hard armoring will be limited under coastal act policies. Sea level rise will require an incremental approach using a combination of short and long-term actions to reduce risk and address future conditions. The corridor is expected to remain in its current alignment for the following reasons. The corridor along the bay provides a direct connection between the communities of Eureka and Arcata. Relocation inland would displace communities along Myrtle Avenue and Old Arcata Road and would cause significant environmental impacts. Relocation would also be cost prohibitive, likely several $100 million. So in the end, a combination of approaches will be likely implemented, such as protection in place by levees, raised as a fill prism or reconstructed as a causeway or viaduct by the end of the century. And finally, these approaches will be informed by environmental impact analysis, design and constructability constraints, and a feasibility study.
And so Clancy, before you move on, there was a question about when you talked about explaining what you meant by when it floods 4 times a year as part of the conditions. If you could say a little bit more about that. So there's a question in the chat before we move on.
Sure. So I think in 2005 or 2006, there was a king tide event where we had overtopping on the northbound lane, and we ended up closing the facility for a certain amount of time. And from what I understand is that if we have that kind of frequency of closing the facility, and we have 4 flood events in 1 year, that means that we're going to have to accelerate our process. So instead of a 5-year plan, we're going to have a 2-year plan, possibly. So it's a trigger to make us move faster.
Okay, thanks, Clancy. So please continue.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about Caltrans' role. Here's a picture of me. Actually, it's a cartoon by Terry Torgerson. Initially, when the coastal development permit was issued, Caltrans was under the impression that we had 10 years to do a plan. The commission decided that it was better to do it in 5 years. And so we're doing a 10-year plan in 5 years, and we're doing our best. The Coastal Commission approved the project, and there is much work to be done. And I got permission from the artist for this cartoon. So roads, bridges, and culverts are some of the assets that we have looked at from a vulnerability assessment standpoint and from an adaptation priority standpoint. We also plan to use other studies such as the California Coastal Commission's sea level rise guidance, which is soon to be adopted and finalized. We're also studying changes in temperature, changes in precipitation, wildfire, sea level rise, storm surge, and cliff retreat. And then I want to also acknowledge that there are other vulnerable segments in District 1. From South Bay to Elk River to Clam Beach to Big Lagoon, Freshwater Lagoon, and Klamath. And most of you are familiar with the Last Chance Grade project and the vulnerabilities of that portion of 101. The feasibility of alternatives on the corridor are very important as a part of the process. However, doing nothing is not an option when it comes to climate change. On the corridor, we will be evaluating adaptation alternatives and the feasibility of several potential alternatives. The potential alternatives include accommodation, protection, relocation. So here's a picture of Fern Bridge, Eel River, Highway 211, and it's vulnerable to flooding, sea level rise and storm surge. Here's an example of a causeway or viaduct, which is an example of an accommodation measure, but it's also the most expensive measure. We can either span the entire corridor or use a causeway to span portions of the corridor at more vulnerable or lower elevations. The Willits bypass was proposed 6 decades ago, and the project cost between $300 and $400 million. The levees in this case serve 2 purposes. It protects infrastructure inland, and it also serves as a recreation or transportation opportunity for people. This is an example of a protective measure where the roadway is completely raised, kind of like what we have right now. Raised roads offer some protection from sea level rise and storm surge, but wave attenuation can quickly unravel roads like this one. Here's an image of a protective berm, which exists along the railroad prism currently. This is a common example that most people have seen along Humboldt Bay. It's a protective measure, a berm or levee. It's often designed with hard armoring or riprap, and is often inconsistent with current coastal policies. Another potential project alternative is a living shoreline or natural shoreline infrastructure. It's preferable to hard armoring. For protection against flooding and erosion caused by sea level rise and extreme storms, California is emphasizing a design approach called natural shoreline infrastructure, which is designed as using natural ecological systems or processes to reduce vulnerability to climate-related hazards while increasing the long-term adaptive capacity of coastal areas by perpetuating the natural system. Currently, Humboldt County is working on a pilot project to install a living shoreline along US 101. Also, the city of Arcata is working to develop some natural shoreline infrastructure. Caltrans participates with the county as part of the technical working group. Lastly, relocation is an alternative that we must consider, but it would be along Old Arcata Road. And as I said before, the impacts would be disparate. At this point, I'd like to offer questions and answers.
Okay, thank you, Clancy. So we've had a couple of questions come in, a few comments. I can read them off. And I want to follow up on a question that is for Jeff Pimentel. When you were talking about the project where the bids were rejected, we had a question, the person wanted to know why were all the bids rejected?
All right, so on the item of the rejection of the bids, with the soft soils that we have out there in the project limit, it was going to take approximately 6 seasons to build the project. And so we set out with a consultant through a contract we had on the project to see if there was a feasible way to shrink the timeframe of the project. We successfully found a way to do that, utilizing what's called column-supported embankments, and essentially a different construction method than your typical just fill embankment for the approaches of the bridge that utilize essentially concrete piles in the ground to strengthen the subsurface so we wouldn't get the settlement that previously was expected. Now that nature of work traditionally across the nation is done in what's called a design build type format, where the contractor actually furnishes the design for that component of the work. They would go out and do their own geotechnical drilling to verify soil conditions. But in California, we have some strict contracting guidelines, and after receiving the bids and some of the bidder inquiries that came in, it was determined with our legal team that it was in the best interest of the state to not utilize the design build method for that portion of the work, and to actually furnish that design for that portion of the work ourselves. So what we're doing right now is actually working with our consultant to develop that design for that portion of the work. Earlier this month, we went and did some additional subsurface investigations and additional geotechnical drilling, which was just completed about 2 weeks ago. So when we put the project back out to bid, rather than having the contractor furnish the design for that portion of the work, we'll actually have the design already in the contract. So the only reason why we didn't do that formerly was because that's traditionally how this type of work is done. To my knowledge, this is the first time that Caltrans has ever utilized this construction method. So it's definitely new to the state. On a positive note, though, the project was formerly going to take 6 seasons to build, and utilizing this is projected to take only 3. So, some people kind of, you look at it and say, well, we're delaying the project by doing this. And there will be a little bit of a delay in terms of when it starts construction, but with the nature of when the project was going to go out to a contractor in the winter of 21-22, there likely wasn't really going to be any work done in the winter just with the weather. So, we're taking care of that additional geotechnical drilling. We're taking care of that design work that the contractor was going to have to do. So in essence, we're just kind of front loading some of that work now. So perception wise, it seems like the project's going out later, but we're still appearing like we're going to be able to maintain getting the project out to construction well within the 2022 season by doing that work ourselves, and take a lot of liability and uncertainty out of the project that our legal team felt was in there. So
Okay.
I think we're going to have a better project moving forward.
So Jeff, I have 2 comments, questions about the Indianola project. You may be able to speak to them. So one comment is the person's wondering why not save some of the expense for the overpass and just put a signal there and use the money for dealing with the entire project, whatever that will be. And then there was also an additional comment that was, thinking forward to 2050. Why is it continuing when all the corridor will need to be raised before 2050 because of sea level rise? So just wondering if there's any information that you can share, or if there's an upcoming Indianola project meeting where these questions can be answered more in depth.
So in terms of the question regarding the traffic signal at the intersection, I know that came up years ago when project alternatives were studied in terms of what do we do to deal with safety at this intersection where we've had fatalities, collisions with injuries. And while I don't have all the details at my fingertips right now, and multiple alternatives were studied through the environmental process, and it was determined that the grade separation, which is what's being constructed now, is what was needed to meet the purpose and need of the project, and that a traffic signal would not accomplish that goal. I am likely certain that within the environmental document, some of those details might be found in there. And then remind me, Joan, on the second question. Actually, I got it. It was 2050. You mentioned that we're expected to have to raise the 101. Why not wait or why spend this money now? Essentially, I think was the question.
Correct.
So we have an immediate safety need out there now that we need to address related to the fatalities and injuries that have occurred at that intersection, as well as other intersections in the corridor that we're planning to close in terms of the median crossings, such as at Mid-City, Harper Ford, at Break Cut, at Bayside Cutoff. So being that it's a safety need, we wouldn't wait to do something just because we are likely going to have to adapt into the future, which is yet even to be determined how we adapt to sea level rise. So for that reason, we're moving forward due to the safety need at these locations in the corridor.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeff. So Clancy, I have a couple of questions for you. The first one focuses on the living shoreline. And Allie wants to know, what are the pros and cons of establishing a living shoreline?
One of the pros would be it mimics the existing natural functions. And so if we're worried about waves, you know, crashing on the shoreline or the right of way and unraveling the road, if we have a natural shoreline in those areas, the natural systems can protect that infrastructure. And at the same time, you know, it's not putting cement or other chemicals into the ecosystem.
Okay. And is there anything related to cost maybe? Is there a cost saving involved, or do they require substantial engineering?
I'm not sure if the costs are on the same level as a hard armoring option.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the biggest problems is getting it through a permitting system. A permitting system, you know, doesn't usually look at innovative ways to complete projects. And so I think just trying to convince people that these are good things could be difficult.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the cons can be kind of getting it through the approval process because it's innovative, it's untried, and Caltrans does need the approval of several regulators for a project like that.
Well, and another issue, like I mentioned before, is not just the regulatory process. It's, you know, there's such a patchwork of ownership along the corridor, you know, from private property to public property to utility lines and billboards. And so there's a lot of complicating factors. It's not as easy as just walking in and getting a permit. So there's, you know, how do you stage these projects? How do you implement them? It's all new.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then there's a question, what are the percent effectiveness for each of the shoreline approach? Do you have any kind of statistics or data which might be the best case scenario for the climate at that specific location?
At this point, I would say no, I don't know that, but we are working with an engineer on some design alternatives, and I will be following really closely the work that the city of Arcata and the county of Humboldt are doing on the pilot project and on their other projects. So it's sort of an incremental approach.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thanks, Clancy. So we have just a comment about Caltrans needing to plan based on science. While taking the long-term action of acquiring land needed to route through Old Arcata Road is disparate, this is the level of science-based sea level rise. This is inevitable, right? Is that correct?
It's inevitable that sea level rise will affect our facility and our communities.
Yeah. I think that may be the question. And Mr. Clark, if you want to clarify, we're happy to take another shot at it if I didn't interpret it properly. Okay. Thank you. We have another question. Does Caltrans plan to study the environmental impacts and mitigation costs of the various alternatives so the public can consider those factors while thinking about the pros and cons of the options for adapting to sea level rise? It could avoid a lot of conflict to do as much of that as possible earlier in the process than what we've seen in some other planning efforts.
I would say yes. Like we're required to do so by the conditions of the permit, but also just as part of our mission. I mean, you know, equity, climate action, and safety. So we will be looking at the least damaging environmental alternative. We're going to look at environmental impacts. We're going to look at constructability, feasibility, all of those things. And we're happy to welcome the public into that process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think tonight's workshop is, you know, one of the many opportunities that there will be for the public to weigh in, and specifically at key points to inform the plan.
Absolutely.
Okay. I know other questions for any of the Caltrans team, whether it's Clancy or Jeff?
I got one in the chat that was private to me. I could read it and then I could try to answer it.
Go ahead.
So this one's from Chet Ogan, and it says, why is using Humboldt Bay dredge spoils to create living shorelines not considered an option? It is considered an option. You know, the Harbor and Conservation District actively dredges navigation channels, and the Corps of Engineers actively dredges the opening of Humboldt Bay. And, you know, using those spoils is an option. One of the problems of beneficial reuse is that you have to get the soil tested and make sure that it's okay to put where you're going to put it. And then when you decide where you want to place this stuff, you got to make sure that you're not impacting eelgrass or, you know, animals or recreation. So it is an option. It's just it's kind of like the living shoreline issue. We have to sort of take another look at how we do these things, and it can't always be a hard armoring engineering issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's a
yeah,
question.
And another thing, I'll say one more thing. Living shorelines often involve wetland fill, and so it makes permitting complicated because it costs more to mitigate than what you're actually trying to work out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And has Caltrans implemented a living shoreline elsewhere? And if yes, how successful has it been?
I don't think we have. And yeah, I don't think we have.
Okay.
But
no. There may be other living shorelines that have been done by other agencies other than Caltrans. But
yeah, there was a good series on sea level rise in the San Francisco Chronicle recently, and they had a bunch of options for San Francisco Bay where they were going to implement some of these things. And so if people want to check it out, you should go to San Francisco Chronicle and check it out.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Will the design alternatives include consideration of growth of the bay and associated saltwater wetlands to the east side of the highway?
Definitely, you know, the diked former tidelands and their relationship to saltwater intrusion and being turned back into tidelands is definitely a consideration. I mean, you know, when Jeff was talking about additional geotechnical work at Indianola, you know, those are the factors that we have to sort of look into before we decide to build things. We need to make sure that it's going to be stable and it's going to be safe. Mm-hmm. So we're definitely going to look at those conversions.
Okay, thanks, Clancy. Let's see, we had another question come in. Is Caltrans calculating the costs of acquiring old Arcata Road right-of-ways compared to the costs of a 6-mile bridge? Isn't this entire area slated to be completely inundated?
Yeah, we're looking at all those factors. I mean, a lot of options are on the table. Like I said before, the most likely option is that we maintain the current right-of-way and alignment with a hybrid of approaches. Mm-hmm. But we will evaluate the benefit cost of going another route.
Okay, so definitely a lot of options are being looked at and considered. Let's see, do we have any more questions coming in right now? Yeah, I think the chat has slowed down a little bit. So let's see. Okay, we just had a comment come in about hope for the rail prism can be part of the solution to sea level rise. And so is rail being looked at, whether it's removing any rail infrastructure or looking at them as part of Humboldt's future transportation and recreation needs? How is rail being considered?
One of the things that that we talked about were short-term and long-term solutions. And, you know, the completion of the Bay Trail, which is along the railroad prism, will be elevated a foot or two once it's completed. And so that's going to be like one of the short-term measures to protect that side of the highway. Will be the Bay Trail. And so the rail's probably not going to come back. It's probably going to remain a recreational corridor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This question came in earlier. Clancy, when you were talking about the flood events, you responding to the question about 4 flood events occurring. There's a comment that one of the flood events you mentioned lasted an hour. And the person was wondering about Caltrans being able to push back and only have to count flood events that last for a tidal cycle, not just any level of flooding. Are there parameters on how long that flood event has to occur?
I'd have to go back and reread the special condition again and look at the rationale for it. But I read it earlier today, and it didn't look like it got down to that minutia. But that's a good point. I don't think, I think we could probably make the case if it was a short-term event, but I doubt it. It seems like it's a pretty hard and fast condition.
Okay.
But I would certainly, be in contact with the Coastal Commission, if those events occurred, we would definitely, we're always in dialogue with the Coastal Commission, but we would definitely be in touch.
Okay. And I have a couple of questions coming in related to schedule. So I just want to hold off on them because I know that's our next slide. Let's see, we have a comment about that sea level rise will accelerate for decades, and the sea level rise estimates are frequently being adjusted upward. Given this, doesn't this argue for a causeway that provides greater clearance, that it will last longer and have habitat and restoration value?
I mean, yeah, that's a good argument. One of the other things that we have to sort of think about is there are facilities and properties and people on the eastern side of the right of way, and so anything that we do, we have to consider our neighbors, like the airport or the people that live on Jacobs Avenue or the building or the businesses on Jacobs Avenue. So, like I said, we're all in it together, but at the same time, Caltrans is a pretty big player on this whole corridor, and anything we do could have an impact on our neighbors. So we are considering those issues.
Okay, let's see. So how about if I have 2 questions related to the schedule, and maybe you could answer them in that context. So there's someone wanting to know about the timeline for decision-making being 2025, and then how soon after decisions are made will construction begin?
Oh, that's a good point. Well, the plan is due December 2025, and we're supposed to plan for sea level rise for 2100. And so I think it's likely that, a lot of the projects will be implemented long after some of us are here. It's going to be a process that takes a while. Sometimes these projects take a long time to deliver. There's a lot of things to consider, like I said, utility lines, property owners, design constructability, environmental impact analysis. And so I don't have a good number on when we're going to start these projects.
Okay, so why don't you just give us kind of a quick high level of review of what's happening with the planning process between now and December 2025 when it needs to be complete. And then we're going to move to, we can continue to take questions, but we also want to maximize the time that we have to get comments from you.
Sure. So if you can see the blue square on this very busy timeline, this is what we're doing right now. It's the public workshop. A lot of the other things on this list are annual monitoring that we do for, every year we go out and we film the king tides. This year, I'm gonna see if I can get our drone team to fly the corridor, the sections that we look at the most vulnerable spots for data. My colleagues, Jason Meyer and Felicia Zimmerman, do a lot of the annual reporting. And we're planning on doing another workshop in the spring. But right now we're, behind the curtain, we're working on engineering alternatives and roadway designs and trying to incorporate all the advice and things that we've gotten from the public and the Coastal Commission. But so right now we're working on some alternatives and geohazard analysis. and yeah, just plodding along.
Okay. So, and again, we'll be back out in the spring with an update and additional opportunities for participation. We do have a question about 101 south of Eureka, that it seems like that's the most vulnerable and will be inundated first. So is that area being given a priority in the planning process? You know, wouldn't that shape what would be coming next?
Yeah, I mean, we're well aware that there are other vulnerable assets on our system. My primary role, 50% of my job is working on this comprehensive plan for the Eureka-Arcata corridor. Eventually, I'll be more involved in a lot of the other planning processes for the rest of our assets. But right now, most of my time is devoted to this project. But we are definitely well aware of the other vulnerable areas, and we are working on it.
Okay, and then we had another question taking us back to rail use. You know, how Caltrans includes rail use as part of its total transportation package for the state. You know, aren't Caltrains used in other areas? Why isn't rail part of this picture, or is it?
I'm going to punt that to my superior, Mr. Brad Medham.
Okay.
So as many of us know, there was rail for a time into this area. It has not been operational since the 90s. You know, it's not our expectation that rail will return to this area anytime soon, although they are taking the North Coast Rail Authority properties and rail banking them so that right of way could be available. Across the state, however, we are focused on rail, including passenger rail in ways to finally, you know, get people out of their cars. But we don't see that being a viable alternative over here at this time.
Okay, thanks, Brad. So I know there's still a few comments and questions in the chat, and we're going to continue, but I want to take us to our digital whiteboard so that we can really stay focused on your issues and concerns. So Clancy, thanks for your presentation and for walking us through the schedule. So now I'm being supported by my two colleagues, Anna, who helped with the polling, and also Sasha, and we're making sure that we get everything in the chat. And now we want to continue to hear your issues and concerns. So you don't have to, you can still ask questions, but you can also just make some straightforward comments. And there's a few of them that have come in, and we'll get them on the whiteboard so that you can all have a sense of what's going on. Let's see. So we have, what sea level rise planning is happening to protect Highway 255? So I don't know if Clancy, if that's you or Brad.
It's probably not Clancy, so I'll go ahead and take it.
Okay.
Certainly, we have low spots on 255 that we're concerned about. You know, it's become even more important now that we're putting broadband conduit out to the cable landing site that's out at the Harbor District. You know, so we haven't taken a look at the level of detail we have on the Eureka-Arcata corridor yet, but it is part of what we have to look at. And Clancy, I don't know if you want to show what. No, it's not. We do have a adaptation priorities report that looks at vulnerability locations across the entire district, and it includes 255. So we're certainly actively aware of it.
Okay, thanks, Brad. So we have a comment about a sense of urgency. So if an expensive solution like a causeway makes better sense here, why shouldn't we get going on it right away before things in SF get dire and the state directs a lot of resources there? So this person is focused on urgency and helping Humboldt stay as a priority. Any comments on that? Or we can just continue to receive what's coming in. And
you know,
this is,
I'm not sure if I can comment as much as they would like, but we have been pushing this issue well since I first got here in 2013, and we had already started doing studies looking at it. It's just a tremendously complex issue that involves not just us, but all the other infrastructure that you're talking about. The concern about, you know, what do we do when, you know, Long Beach and San Diego start to get their feet wet is very real, because there's not going to be money for everything. And so I totally understand and agree with the concept of, we have to get in there with our concepts as early as possible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Brad. So now, now we'd love to get your comments. So your issues and concerns, we'll get them on the whiteboard so that you can track the conversation, but I'll be reading them as they come in. So Caltrans needs to work with adjacent landowners like CDFW, ranchers, etc., since sea level rise and any adaptation measures will impact all of these lands. Okay, other comments or concerns about that you want to make sure Caltrans is considering as they proceed with this planning process. This is the time where we really want to hear from you, get your thoughts and ideas, and most importantly, what are you most concerned about? How this is going to affect how you're able to travel. We have a comment about the plan. This person says it should emphasize allowing the landward migration of estuarine and salt marsh habitat during sea level rise, rather than the corridor impeding that landward migration. Okay. And if there's anything, Clancy or Brad, that you want to add to clarify or add to these comments, we're happy to take that feedback as well. Okay, so other comments coming in. Tell us your issues and concerns. We want to get them on the board. Okay, we have a concern: slowing down the speed limit will cut emissions and slow down sea level rise. This should be a priority. Okay, so really going at it systematically. Okay, other comments. What are you most concerned about? And there's Caltrans is getting advice and comment. Let's see. So we have a comment on related to the equity statement. That it sounds good, but nobody polled today saying that they represented tribal representatives or indigenous communities. Did Caltrans conduct specific outreach to local Native communities? So Clancy or Brad, maybe if you could speak a little to how the tribes are communicated with, the invitations they received, and other activities that Caltrans has done.
Sure, and I'll probably take that one. So Caltrans District 1 has a Native American liaison who works with the tribes on an ongoing basis. There are 109 federally recognized tribes in the state. 28 of them are in the 4 counties that we cover. So we've got fully, a quarter of the tribes in the state are in our area. So we are very active working with the tribe. My boss, the district director, and others meet formally with tribal councils on a regular basis. And we try to make certain that they understand what we're doing and how and why we're doing it, because their issues are sometimes unique and we have to address those.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Let's see, we have a comment here. Going with the viaduct or causeway with the buy-in of adjacent landowners is an opportunity, not only to restore the natural tidal cycle and mitigate past land use decisions, but also to set an example of how this can be done throughout the state. And Carolyn, thanks for your comment. It's helpful to give us some initial feedback on some of the potential alternatives Caltrans presented today. We have another comment. Let's see. Will the bridge under construction just south of Arcata be incorporated into the corridor? Let's see. Yes. Jeff? Oh. Could you repeat that?
So the question was, the bridge south of Arcata, is it being included in the sea level rise study?
Yes, in the corridor, yes, within the planning and improvements for the corridor.
Yeah, so as part of our Eureka-Arcata corridor project, one of our conditions as part of our coastal, or trying to remember the terminology, our consistency determination with the Coastal Commission one of the four conditions we had was related to sea level rise. And so while the corridor projects that are in construction, completed, and yet to come are not involved with making any changes to the profile of the overall corridor, we did accommodate sea level rise projections in terms of the elevations of those structures, as well as including certain design features that make them adaptable into the future as we, as the sea level rise planning and future projects are initiated and happen, whatever those might be. So, with the Indianola undercrossing that we will be beginning construction later next year, and then with the Jacoby Creek bridge replacement that's currently ongoing, those were set at certain elevations based on our coastal development permit and coordination with the Coastal Commission on that. But we made those abutments such that and I'm trying to recall the name of them now, but essentially we'd be able to more readily kind of fill in gaps beneath the structure deck and the abutments of those bridges as we may need to raise them. If the direction of adaptability for sea level rise were actual raising of 101, its existing alignment, we'd be able to do that without reconstructing all of those improvements. Now those structures obviously have a useful life, so that would need to come into play in terms of what years these projects may come in if that's the direction things go. But they're within the corridor, so they would be included in those assessments. But we try to think ahead and make the design so they could be more adaptable depending on what happens in the future. So I hope that answers the question.
So we have a comment about the planning horizon. Person is stating that the planning horizon should be 75 to 100 years, which is in line with the Coastal Commission guidance for major public infrastructure projects. Can any of you speak to the general planning horizon that is being used for the various decisions being made in this process?
I would say it was based on what the coastal development permit required us to do. We're certainly going to use other guidance that the Coastal Commission and the Ocean Protection Council have promulgated, but we're tied in time to what the rules and regulations were at the time. But we're going to use the best available science. And I'll pass it over to Brad.
Thank you, Clancy. And I would just add to that we intend this plan to be an adaptive plan. It's going to have to grow and change as more information comes through. So we're basing it on the best available science now, but 25 years from now, we may know a lot more, and the decisions may have to be adjusted to match that.
Okay, great, thank you. So I have a comment. Caltrans should fully incorporate cycling and pedestrian transportation in this plan, rather than relegate non-motorized transportation concerns and planning to local agencies, such as the county and cities of Arcata and Eureka. Is active transportation addressed in this plan, or how is that talked about?
I mean, it's going to be part of the plan. I mean, we partner with the county and the cities and the Humboldt Council on governments, and it's all part of what we're evaluating. And Caltrans is a big promoter of active transportation. Okay. Because it reduces greenhouse gases.
Great. So a comment that's a follow-up to Brad's point. There are several public, private, and private utility assets currently protected from daily inundation by the 101 corridor and the trail. I'm looking forward to continued and more extensive collaboration among these partners to ensure that no one gets left behind in this planning. I appreciate the commitment to partnership. Can the state fund a working group to ensure these stakeholders are at the table?
I guess I'll take that one. So I'm not certain that we can provide funding for everyone to come to the table, but they're certainly right that we all have to find a way to talk about these assets. One of our early studies, the one that we were doing back in 2013, identified that 70% of this corridor is protected by somebody else's levy. So it's not only are we protecting other people, but there are people that are protecting us. And if we don't all work together on this, no one's got enough money or time to fix it by themselves. So somehow we have to work together to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Brad. And I think the next question is for you. How will the planning and implementation timeline of this project differ from the Willits bypass?
Well, that's an interesting comparison. For those of you who remember, it took us about 40 years to go through the Willits bypass process, which should not have taken that long. This, we're going to be doing sea level rise planning for 40 years and more. The question is, it won't be, it's not going to be a one and done kind of thing. We're going to have to continue to look at our facilities. Now, because we're focusing tonight on the Eureka-Arcata corridor, I think that is going to be a fairly robust plan that tells us where we need to go. But then I have to turn my attention to places like the Garcia River in Mendocino County on Highway 1, which closed for flooding this last storm cycle. So, we have places within our system right now that are being closed periodically. We'll be doing sea level rise for a long time.
Okay, thank you, Brad. So let's think about what are your ideas and alternatives? We're looking for solutions, strategies. I know in the previous issues and concerns, we had strategies of advancing active transportation, slowing speed limits. But what other ideas do people have? Okay, so we have a comment here. It would be great to have a plan in place for temporarily switching to a 2-lane highway or setting up a detour when the southbound lanes are flooded. People don't need to travel the corridor when there's a massive storm and high tide flooding the highway. Okay, so a suggestion about some flexibility in the highway during special conditions. What other ideas do people have? And again, this is, we know many of you, know the area very well. Some of you have traveled to other places and have seen ideas there. So we'd really like to hear any ideas or suggestions that you might have. Okay, well, it seems like the solutions are a little bit harder. But we do, Caltrans does spend quite a bit of time on the issues and concerns. Okay, so we have a comment about the levee system. It's dependent on levee maintenance, and a suggestion that Humboldt County needs to form a levee special district for levee maintenance and funding for existing levees before Caltrans creates more levees. So being proactive about the maintenance for the levee, given its important role in addressing sea level rise. Okay, other ideas and comments that people have, or questions too. We have our team here, and they've fielded every question that's come in through the chat. There was a comment earlier that came through about of the alternatives, that they all have trade-offs, and I think that that's something that Caltrans will be looking at. Let's see. So we have another suggestion, using viaducts and causeways, living shorelines, and raising the road in place, doing a combination of the design alternatives. Then we have an idea for several larger bridges, large enough to allow for tidal flow. Maybe that could work instead of a viaduct. A comment about people with disabilities needing to be a larger part of this conversation about active transportation for all modes of transit. And I think, Clancy mentioned in the equity statement, making sure that this planning effort is inclusive and doesn't disproportionately impact any group. Is there any additions in terms of interactions with the community that serves people with disabilities? I know we have been reaching out to have them participate in the workshop. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, let's see, other ideas and alternatives. And we still have a few minutes for some additional questions and comments. And I'll just move the whiteboard and we can just do a little review while people are looking at or thinking of maybe some comments or questions. So, you know, we've gotten a lot of questions answered. You know, a focus on would 101 South have a focus to it? Some emphasis on collaboration, a lot of questions and comments about bridges being used and some opportunities there. A desire for it to get underway, a sense of urgency, looking at, you know, what can we do now? Can we slow traffic? Can we get more people using active transportation? Let's see, so I've had some comments come in. So earlier this summer, the Biden administration announced the Justice 40 initiative, which ensures that federal agencies work with state and local communities to deliver 40% of the benefits from federal investments in climate action to disadvantaged communities. And this is from Jimmy Tran, one of our Caltrans colleagues. One example of a program in this initiative is that by the Department of Homeland Security's flood mitigation program. So now here's the question for Clancy or Brad. Has Caltrans looked into this or other federal funding sources for the proposed short and long-term adaptation projects and strategies?
Thanks for your comment, Jimmy. I actually attended a webinar on this yesterday. So we're in the process of looking at funding sources and other options.
Okay, great. So it sounds like our team is on top of that and seeking to pursue it as an option. We have a question. Are the current bridge proposals calculated to handle the anticipated maximum sea level rise?
The Jacoby Creek Bridge?
Well, it says it references the current bridge proposal, so that may be one of them.
I believe so. I believe Project Manager Pimentel was talking about how both the Indianola Undercross and the Jacoby Creek Bridge were designed to accommodate sea level rise in their implementation. Brett?
I'll just sort of take over from that. Jeff was mentioning that the bridges are designed to be able to be adapted. We did pick a particular sea level rise scenario. The problem is that there are widely different sea level rise scenarios. And so, you know, did we accommodate like the H++, which is one of the most conservative? No, but you know, we did accommodate what would be considered a general middle of the road sea level rise, and then we made the structures adaptive so that we could change them if we need to. He mentioned the service life. You know, a lot of the question will become how fast, right? How quickly will it happen? Because it may be the next bridge that has to be built to those standards and not this one.
Okay, thanks, Brad.
Hey, Brad, Joan, I wanted to just add something on what Brad said there. And also part of the thinking behind the development of those projects, both with Indianola yet to be constructed and Jacoby Creek, is that since the sea level rise predictions are predictions, and they are based on science, going too far to the extreme also means the project costs more. So, you know, it's a balance between how much we're spending now without the certainty of what that sea level rise is actually going to be so far into the future, but while still making the project adaptable. So depending on how the predictions actually turn out, we could still, you know, react to them without having, you know, significant extent. So that was also part of the factor in determining where to place those.
Okay, thanks for that additional information, Jeff. So we have a comment. Government agencies with jurisdiction in and around Humboldt Bay need to form a task force, JPA, special district, to plan for and mitigate against the effects of sea level rise. Would Caltrans be willing to participate in such a joint effort?
Yes.
Most definitely.
Okay. Let's see. There's a question about just getting a copy of the materials. So this presentation is being recorded, and then we also have Clancy's PowerPoint presentation, and they will be remediated for ADA accessibility. We'll add captioning to the videos, and that's going to be posted on the Caltrans District 1 site. And when that's available, we're going to send an email to the entire list that those materials are posted, and that that's a good source of information for, you know, to learn more about what's going on. Let's see, we have a comment. Insisting stakeholders invest in protective or restoration measures or seriously consider early relocation retreat. Though Caltrans is doing a great job using science-based data as well as early engagement with the community, it's not all Caltrans's job to protect the adjacent assets. And so maybe you can speak to, you know, as you mentioned, you know, Caltrans has its responsibilities, but then there are adjoining landowners and such. And so how do you figure out who's responsible for what?
I think that's why we're so strongly urging that there to be a collaborative effort, because the lines are going to be very difficult to determine. You know, there's a question, an open question in my mind is, you know, if, for example, we build a viaduct and we allow water to pass underneath our facility and the airport goes away, is there a liability to us because of that? You know, that's why we want to be planning jointly. It's quite frankly why we were hoping for 10 years rather than 5 years to do this, because it's a complex, you know, issue involving private parties, public utilities, you know, government agencies, and all of us have to somehow come to some equality of discontent on the decision.
Okay, so okay, here's a question. How long will it take to build the 6-mile long bridge? So if you do the full, I guess, bridge or causeway, what does something like that take?
There's a saying in many agencies: if you give me enough money, I can do anything, right? And that's true of this. Now, you know, how long does it take to build it? Well, it probably takes 2 or 3 seasons, you know, 2 or 3 construction seasons to build it. But there's probably 10 to 15 years worth of development time prior to that. And a lot of it depends on whether or not, you know, as we mentioned earlier in this meeting, you know, it took us 40 years on the Willits bypass because we had to work through the process of, does it make sense for everybody, and who's in favor of it? And, you know, I mean, that project cost us approximately $450 million, but the construction cost was about $150 million. All the rest of it was spent on mitigation and, you know, and money spent working with our folks and the outside world.
Okay, so we have complex projects that require substantial collaboration, which really makes it difficult to predict the length of time and how that's going to impact cost over time as well. Do we have any other issues or concerns, or any strategies or ideas that you want to share with Caltrans? We just have about 5 minutes left. So I'll give you a moment to get, you know, any additional final comments in today's chat. But again, remember, this isn't the only opportunity. And let's see. Okay, we have a comment in response to Brad's comment. The Willits bypass cost that Brad just mentioned is exactly why I think the public should have a chance to consider those costs when we're being asked to provide input. Okay, so if there's a way to maybe put in some additional cost information so that people can understand kind of the scale of the effort that's being involved. And we have a couple of folks who have to hop off, but Caltrans is getting some good feedback on, you know, the participation and also taking on these hard issues. And then just another comment about costs and environmental impacts. key issues and concerns for this person. Any other comments? And you can still send them into the chat up until the point we shut off the Zoom. But I think with that, we're going to wrap up. So, I'm just going to pull back here and show, we have quite a volume of comment. I do, before you go away, what's the best way to keep you all involved? We mentioned, and if you could just, fire these up in the chat. I want to make sure we wrap up before 7:30. Any ideas? What's the best way for you to get information? Organizations that you rely on that maybe Caltrans can make sure they're sharing information with. Your ideas there. We will be sending you a follow-up email and starting that interested parties list from this workshop. And again, there will be a web page on the Caltrans site that provides some core information about tonight's activities. I'm seeing a couple ideas come in referencing the Baykeeper email, the El Lanador HSU newspaper is specifically called out, some of the nonprofit newsletters. The North Coast Environmental Center is another organization that can help get the word out. Another reference to the Sea Level Rise Initiative at Humboldt State University. And I know Caltrans has been working closely with them. So anyhow, let's just keep these ideas coming in. Again, validation that email's great, but also looking for other newsletters and journals to help keep the community informed. The Tri-County Independent Living Center is offered as another place to share and provide information. So, well, these are all very helpful ideas, and we can check back in with the public engagement plan that we have and our stakeholder lists and make sure that we have all these ideas included. 350 Humboldt was just added. So with that, I want to turn it back to Brad and Clancy for some final words. Between now, the next outreach activity is scheduled for sometime in the spring 2022. Is there anything else that the community can look forward to? And then any other final words you have for us tonight?
Shall I start?
Please.
Sure.
All right. So I think the first thing I want to say is thank you. What we're trying to do here is to get other viewpoints, get other ideas. And this is, I think, a good forum to do that. Everyone's invested their time, working hard to try to come up with ideas. And we're not geniuses. We recognize that sometimes we have a fairly focused viewpoint, and hearing from other viewpoints and other perspectives is critically important to getting this done. So thank you for the time that you spent tonight to do this. Clancy?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your comments and your participation and your kindness. And yeah, we're all in it together.
Okay. Well, with that, we really appreciate your participation. We download and we save everything that you've sent us in the chat. So we really appreciate all of your input tonight. We hope that you'll stay involved. If you know someone who registered and they missed it, let them know to check the Caltrans website, probably in about a week. But we'll also notify people when those materials are available. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues, Anna and Sasha, for helping to support tonight's meeting. And I want to thank Jeff Pimentel for answering all the questions and keeping us up to date on what's happening in the corridor. Brad, for your opening words and all your questions, and Clancy for all your technical expertise and your thorough presentation. We really appreciate you all. And with that, we are adjourned. Good night.
Thank you.